On March 11th, 1942, just 3 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, over 10,000 soldiers received orders to build a road through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The mission was called Operation Alcan. The goal was simple, impossible. Connect Alaska to the continental United States by carving a 1,700-mile highway through Canadian wilderness in less than a year. What most people don't know is that during those 8 months of frantic construction, at least 30 workers died in ways that were quickly forgotten. Some vanished entirely from records. Others drowned in a single catastrophic moment that was immediately buried by military censors. And the men who did the work, including nearly 4,000 segregated African American soldiers, were never properly recognized. Their sacrifice would be hidden for decades. This is the story of the Alaska Highway. A road built so fast, with such urgency, that no one bothered to count how many bodies it left behind. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything for America. Suddenly, Alaska wasn't a distant frontier, it was a potential invasion point. Military strategists feared that Japanese warships could reach the Alaska coast, potentially establishing a foothold just across the Pacific. The threat felt real. On June 3rd and 4th, 1942, Japanese warplanes actually bombed the American naval base at Dutch Harbor in Alaska. It wasn't a major attack, but it confirmed the American government's worst fears. Alaska had to be defended, but there was a problem. Getting supplies and troops to Alaska meant shipping everything by boat or plane from California. No road existed. No overland route connected the continental United States to Alaskan military installations. If a serious Japanese invasion began, America couldn't reinforce Alaska quickly enough. By February 1942, just 60 days after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized construction of the Alaska Highway. It would begin in British Columbia and stretch 2,500 kilometers, roughly 1,570 miles, through the Yukon Territory and into Alaska. The entire project had to be completed in 8 months. Construction began on March 11, 1942. Within hours, bulldozers were pushing into uncharted wilderness. Nobody had an accurate map. The terrain had barely been surveyed. Engineers were essentially building the road as they went, trying to plot the best route while simultaneously carving it through mountains, swamps, and permafrost. More than 25,000 men were assembled for the project. Roughly 11,000 were soldiers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The rest were civilians and Canadian troops. What's significant is how these men were organized. The U.S. military segregated the workforce. Approximately 4,000 African American soldiers, organized into separate regiments, worked alongside white soldiers on different sections. The black soldiers worked just as hard. They faced the same brutal conditions, but their contribution would be almost completely erased from official history. To understand why the Alaska Highway seemed impossible, you need to understand the terrain. This wasn't cleared farmland. This was one of the most unforgiving environments in North America. The route crossed dense boreal forests so thick that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. It crossed rivers swollen with snowmelt. It traversed vast expanses of muskeg, which is basically wet peat bog that will swallow a truck if you're not careful. And beneath it all lay permafrost, permanently frozen earth that would collapse if exposed to sunlight or warm air. Building a normal road through permafrost is complicated. Building one in 8 months while the ground is shifting beneath your machines is something else entirely. The climate was another problem. In summer, temperatures could reach 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Mosquitoes hatched in biblical swarms. Early reports describe insects so thick they could actually suffocate a person if they panicked and breathed them in. One soldier described mosquitoes so numerous they turned the sky black. In winter, the temperatures plummeted to -40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The extreme cold would freeze diesel fuel in the tanks of bulldozers. Machine parts became brittle and broke. Tires cracked. Steel snapped. Men working in that cold had to rotate off equipment every 30 minutes or risk frostbite or hypothermia. And they were expected to work nearly 18 to 20 hours a day. Military command understood the stakes. The Japanese had just bombed Alaska. In a very real sense, American soldiers were in a race against invasion. The drive to complete the highway was almost pathological. Officers pushed the men harder and harder. Safety was rarely a priority. Speed was everything. The official slogan was rush, rush, rush. And the men responded. They worked 7 days a week. They worked through Arctic storms. They worked with inadequate equipment and minimal medical support. And people started dying. The first documented deaths occurred early. A soldier drowned crossing a swollen river. A bulldozer operator was buried in a landslide. Men succumbed to dysentery. Others died from pneumonia or other respiratory infections. The record-keeping was chaotic. Most soldiers worked so far from any official post that injuries or deaths might not be reported for weeks. If a man died in a remote camp, far from any military headquarters, the body might be buried locally. No official death certificate, no investigation. In the end, the only record that the man had ever existed was a missing entry in a company roster. By midsummer 1942, the construction effort had organized into 2 main groups. One team, moving south from Alaska, was clearing and building the road northward. The other team, moving north from British Columbia, was pushing into the wilderness from the south. The plan was to have them meet somewhere in the middle, probably around the Yukon Territory. Engineers hoped to meet in 4 months. They actually met in 5.5 months. That was considered ahead of schedule. The engineering challenges were extraordinary. To cross permafrost, workers couldn't simply pave a traditional road on top of frozen ground. When sunlight hit the dark asphalt in summer, the heat would penetrate downward and melt the permafrost underneath. The road would sink. It would buckle. It would become impassable within weeks. To solve this, Army engineers developed what they called corduroy roads. They cut trees and laid them side by side, creating a wooden mat on the ground. On top of that, they added gravel and earth. This layer insulated the permafrost beneath, preventing it from melting. The corduroy roads were rough. Trucks would bounce violently, causing severe back injuries to drivers, but they worked. Rivers were another major obstacle. The Yukon River, the Teslin River, and dozens of smaller streams had to be crossed. In winter and early spring, these rivers were choked with ice. In late spring and summer, they swelled with snowmelt and became impassable torrents. Engineers had to design and build nearly 200 bridges in rapid succession. They used temporary wooden structures, often constructed in just days. Some of these bridges were precarious. Drivers reported feeling the bridge sway and flex beneath their trucks. The mosquitoes caused real suffering. One officer who observed the construction wrote, "I saw fellows so tired they were ready to drop in their tracks. Mosquitoes were landing on their eyes and inside their ears. Some men were actually beaten down by the insect swarms. Soldiers developed a kind of dark humor about it. They joked that the mosquitoes were the real enemy, not the Japanese. The insects were a constant torment that affected productivity, morale, and health. Multiple men were hospitalized with infections caused by mosquito bites that had become infected in the filthy conditions." May 17, 1942, Charlie Lake, British Columbia. This is where one of the deadliest construction accidents in military history occurred. A construction crew was supposed to cross Charlie Lake using a pontoon ferry. The ferry was hastily constructed, built to move bulldozers and heavy equipment across the water. Local Canadian residents who lived near Charlie Lake warned the military commanders that the ferry wasn't safe. They said it was overloaded. They said the construction wasn't solid enough. But the military was obsessed with speed. Orders came down to keep moving, push forward. On that day, a ferry loaded with soldiers and a bulldozer began crossing Charlie Lake. The water was cold, very cold. Snowmelt from the surrounding mountains fed the lake. As the ferry made its way across, something went wrong. The official reports are vague on the exact cause. Some witnesses said the ferry started to list to one side. Others said it simply capsized. What's certain is that the ferry rolled over, dumping soldiers and heavy equipment into the frigid water. 13 men drowned. 13 men, in one moment, in cold water. Many couldn't swim. Some were tangled in equipment or weighed down by their boots and heavy clothing. The rescue effort was chaotic and insufficient. By the time soldiers could recover bodies, most of the 13 were dead from hypothermia and drowning. The official military response was swift and dramatic. The incident was immediately classified as a military matter. The soldiers who witnessed it were ordered not to discuss it. The bodies were buried locally. No ceremony, no fanfare. Military censors forbade any mention of the disaster in letters home. When soldiers' families wrote to ask what happened to their sons, the military gave them minimal information, just an official death notice, no explanation of the circumstances. The Charlie Lake disaster raises troubling questions. Why was a hastily built pontoon ferry being used to transport heavy military equipment across a cold, deep lake? Why weren't life preservers provided? Why were local warnings ignored? The military investigation was cursory. There was no formal inquiry. No one was held responsible. The disaster was handled as a containment problem, not a learning opportunity. The military simply moved the crossing site and continued building the road. But there's something even more troubling. The Charlie Lake disaster wasn't the only major accident. There are references in old military logs to other incidents that killed workers, but the records are incomplete. Some simply say men were lost, with no further explanation. Other incidents aren't recorded at all. A significant number of workers, particularly those from marginalized groups, simply disappeared from employment records. 3,795 African American soldiers served on the Alaska Highway Project. They worked in segregated units, assigned the most dangerous jobs. They were segregated in their living quarters. They ate separately. They were paid less than white soldiers doing identical work, and their contribution was almost completely hidden from history. When the Alaska Highway was completed in October 1942, the famous photograph showing the final link, a white soldier and a black soldier shaking hands, was taken. That image became symbolic. But for decades after the war, the role of black soldiers was minimized or omitted entirely from histories of the Alaska Highway. Some of the African American soldiers who worked on the highway later claimed that casualty figures for black workers were deliberately undercounted. They said deaths among their units were sometimes not reported through official channels. Bodies would be buried in unmarked graves in remote locations. Families would never be notified. The men simply vanished. While historians have been unable to fully verify these claims with documents, the pattern is troubling. Segregated units, remote locations, minimal documentation. The conditions all existed for deaths to go unreported. There's also the question of what happened to the indigenous peoples living near the highway route. The construction brought thousands of outsiders into regions that had been inhabited by First Nations communities for thousands of years. The presence of so many soldiers, with their diseases and their disruption, had catastrophic consequences. One village, called Champaign in the Yukon Territory, was nearly wiped out by an epidemic of infectious disease. The exact death toll isn't known, but accounts suggest that more than half the village perished. This tragedy is barely mentioned in Alaska Highway histories, as if the indigenous casualties don't matter. They were external to the official narrative. By late September 1942, the two construction teams were approaching each other. The southern team, working north from British Columbia, had pushed approximately 900 miles. The northern team, working south from Alaska, had pushed approximately 600 miles. Both teams had overcome obstacles that seemed impossible. But the final section, roughly 200 miles of rough terrain, remained to be connected. On October 25, 1942, the two teams met. The official moment came when a final section of road was completed near the British Yukon border. Military photographers documented the moment. A white soldier and a black soldier shook hands at the point where the road was completed. The photograph became iconic. It represented American unity and military achievement, but it also hid a more complicated truth. The soldiers were segregated in every other way. This moment was literally staged for the cameras. A formal dedication ceremony occurred on November 20th, 1942, marking the Alaska Highway officially open to military traffic. President Roosevelt sent a message congratulating the Army Corps of Engineers. Military leaders spoke proudly of the accomplishment. The Alaska Highway was completed on time. It had taken just 8 months. It was genuinely one of the most impressive engineering and construction feats in American military history. But the cost had been significant. The deaths, the accidents, the diseases, the psychological toll, these weren't discussed at the dedication ceremony. The completed highway was remarkable from an engineering perspective. The road was roughly 18 meters wide in most places, with single-lane bridges where the builders hadn't yet had time to construct full-width crossings. Engineers had invented new techniques for building on permafrost. They had developed rapid bridge construction methods. They had pushed into uncharted territory and mapped it simultaneously with building the road. The achievement was real. The Alaska Highway changed Alaska's military value and ultimately accelerated its path to statehood. Before the highway, Alaska was nearly inaccessible except by air and sea. After the highway, it was connected to the continental United States by road. This changed everything for civilian development and settlement. The highway opened to the public in 1948, and it became a popular route for tourists and settlers. Today, it remains one of North America's most famous scenic drives. It's a symbol of wilderness adventure and discovery. But the human cost of the highway remains largely forgotten. The 30 to 32 officially recorded deaths barely make a footnote in highway histories. The Charlie Lake disaster is mentioned occasionally, but usually in sanitized terms. The contributions of Black soldiers and Indigenous peoples have only recently begun to receive proper attention. Governor Bill Walker of Alaska didn't officially recognize the Alaska Highway veterans until 2017, more than 70 years after construction was complete. It was only in that year that the state government officially acknowledged that the highway was, in some sense, the road to civil rights for African American soldiers. The conditions that killed workers during highway construction have actually repealed themselves in modern times. In 1958, a mining disaster in the same region killed over 100 miners in an underground explosion. In 1964, a major earthquake devastated Anchorage, causing deaths and injuries throughout the region. The landscape around the Alaska Highway has always been unforgiving. It demanded respect. But in 1942, military urgency overruled caution. The Alaska Highway stands today as a monument to American engineering and military capability. Millions of tourists drive it each year, experiencing the wilderness that construction crews conquered 8 decades ago. But how many know the real history? How many know about the 13 men who drowned at Charlie Lake? How many know that workers' names were lost to bureaucratic indifference? How many know that the military deliberately segregated the workforce and then erased most of that contribution from official records? The most troubling question remains unanswered. What is the true death toll of the Alaska Highway? Official records claim 30 to 32 deaths, but contemporary accounts suggest the number could be higher. The segregated units were stationed in remote locations where documentation was minimal. Indigenous communities near the highway were devastated by disease, but their deaths aren't counted in construction casualty figures. Some workers simply vanished from payroll records midway through the project, with no explanation given. The military kept the Charlie Lake disaster secret for decades. It took until 1942's end for the full story to emerge, and even then it was downplayed. If such a major tragedy could be hidden, what else wasn't reported? What unmarked graves exist along the highway route? Which workers' families never learned what happened to their sons? The Alaska Highway was built during wartime, when military necessity was absolute and oversight was minimal. The documents that might have recorded all the deaths, all the accidents, all the human suffering were either never created or were deliberately destroyed. We may never know the complete truth, but we can acknowledge that building the Alaska Highway cost more than the official histories admit. The road was built on urgency and sacrifice, and it was built on silence. If you want to uncover more stories of American infrastructure that have been hidden or forgotten, subscribe to Hidden America. Next time, we'll explore another ambitious construction project with a darker history. We'll investigate the interstate highway system and discover what really happened during its construction. What environmental disasters were covered up? What communities were destroyed? And what did America sacrifice to build its obsession with speed and connectivity? The Alaska Highway connects continents, but it also connects us to a history we're still trying to fully understand. Subscribe for more hidden infrastructure stories. And remember, every bridge we cross, every road we drive has a story. And sometimes that story involves people we've forgotten.